Introduction. The spectacle of the circus has always held a profound fascination for me. There is an unparalleled magic in watching a performer juggle screaming chainsaws or a tightrope walker execute a seemingly impossible succession of mid-air flips. It is an environment dedicated to amazement, where the boundaries of human capability are continually pushed and shattered. As a child, my greatest aspiration was to join this world of spectacular feats. However, my parents harbored a different vision, desiring for me the formal education they had never received, which ultimately guided my path toward the study of medicine. During one otherwise mundane afternoon in a medical school anatomy lecture, a professor was explaining the mechanics of the human throat. To demonstrate how an obstructed passage could be straightened by pushing the chin forward, he displayed an X-ray of a sword swallower mid-performance. In that darkened lecture hall, a sudden flash of inspiration struck me. My childhood dream was entirely salvageable. Not long before this, while studying human reflexes, I had discovered an unusual personal quirk. I could push my fingers further down my throat than any of my peers without triggering a gag reflex. At the time, I viewed it as a trivial, almost undignified party trick, but looking at that X-ray, its true value became blindingly apparent. I resolved right then to master the ancient art of sword swallowing. My early attempts were less than promising. Lacking an actual sword, I repurposed a fishing rod, standing before my bathroom mirror and repeatedly failing to move it past the first inch. Discouraged, I abandoned the pursuit. It was not until 3 years later, while working as a trainee physician, that fate intervened. I was treating an elderly patient afflicted with a stubborn cough. When I inquired about his former profession, I was astonished to learn that he was the very sword swallower from my professor's X-ray. Eagerly, I recounted my dismal failures with the fishing rod. He gently corrected my ignorance, explaining that the human throat is essentially flat. Thus, only a flat instrument can successfully slide down it. That evening, armed with a straight-handled soup ladle, I tried again and effortlessly slid it to the hilt. Elated but unsatisfied with the prospect of being a mere ladle swallower, I scoured the local advertisements and soon procured a genuine 19th century Swedish army bayonet. When I finally slid that blade down my throat, the pride of achieving the impossible was matched only by the quiet satisfaction of finding such a peaceful way to recycle a weapon of war. The art of sword swallowing stands as a visceral testament that the impossible can be realized, challenging humans to look beyond the constraints of the obvious. It is for this reason that I often conclude my lectures on global development with a sudden transformation. Stepping onto a table, I strip off my academic shirt to reveal a black vest adorned with a sequined lightning bolt. Demanding total silence, accompanied only by the dramatic roll of a snare drum, I slide the bayonet down my throat, extending my arms to an audience swept up in absolute awe. But why begin a deep exploration of the world with tales of the circus? Before the grand finale of the bayonet, it is necessary to confront a more intellectual challenge. If you were to sit down with a blank sheet of paper and test your foundational understanding of the planet, you would likely be asked to quantify the trajectory of human progress. You might be asked to estimate what percentage of girls in the most impoverished nations actually complete primary school, or to identify where the vast majority of the human population currently resides. You would need to assess whether extreme poverty has doubled, halved, or stagnated over the last 2 decades and project the current global life expectancy. The questions would probe your expectations of future population growth, the changing rates of fatalities from natural disasters, and the proportion of children globally receiving basic vaccinations. You would be forced to evaluate gender parity in education, the status of endangered species, access to electricity, and the consensus on climate change. If such an inquiry leaves you feeling uncertain, or if your answers prove to be overwhelmingly incorrect, you are in exceptionally good company. Over several decades, this exact type of knowledge has been tested on thousands of individuals across the globe. These are not trick questions. They are straightforward inquiries based on meticulously documented, undisputed data. Yet the results are consistently and profoundly abysmal. Consider the trajectory of extreme poverty. Over the past 20 years, the fraction of the global population trapped in extreme destitution has been cut in half. This is a staggering, revolutionary triumph of human development. arguably the most significant transformation in living memory. Yet, when polled, an astonishingly small fraction of people, typically less than 1 in 10, are aware of this monumental progress. The same pattern holds true for global vaccination rates, where the reality of widespread, nearly universal basic healthcare access eludes the vast majority of the public. The ignorance is not confined to those lacking education. Across audiences comprising medical students, seasoned educators, university professors, multinational executives, prominent journalists, and even Nobel laureates and heads of state, the results remain dismal. Intelligence and academic pedigree offer no protection. The failure is universal. But it is not merely a matter of being wrong, it is a matter of being systematically wrong. The errors are not scattered randomly. If one were to take a stack of bananas marked with multiple choice letters and throw them to a troop of chimpanzees, the primates, selecting purely by chance, would consistently outscore the most educated human audiences. The chimpanzees would achieve a random distribution of correct and incorrect answers. Human beings, however, err in a single, predictable direction. Every group tested holds a mental model of the world that is significantly more terrifying, violent, and hopeless than the empirical reality. This worse-than-random performance presents a profound puzzle. When I first encountered this sweeping ignorance among my brilliant medical students in the 1990s, I was initially relieved, fearing I had nothing new to teach them. But as the testing expanded, the frustration grew. Just as a driver relies on an accurate GPS to navigate a city, policymakers, business leaders, and everyday citizens rely on an accurate worldview to navigate life. How can we solve global crises if our foundational facts are entirely inverted? Late one evening, contemplating this persistent failure, a realization dawned. Random ignorance would yield chimpanzee-like scores. The systematically pessimistic scores indicated the presence of actively wrong knowledge. For years, I diagnosed this as an upgrade problem. I assumed that people were simply navigating the present using the outdated facts taught to them decades earlier by their own teachers. The presumed solution was better pedagogy and clearer data. This initiated a global crusade utilizing animated, elegant data visualizations to expose the beautifully changing world. The presentations were lauded, yet the core pessimism remained untouchable. Audiences would nod in momentary inspiration, only to immediately revert to their entrenched, dramatic misconceptions about poverty and population. The definitive turning point occurred in 2015, before an assembly of the world's most influential leaders, activists, and policymakers. Despite their unparalleled access to real-time data and expert advisors, this elite cohort still performed worse than a troop of guessing apes on fundamental questions regarding global health and demographics. The issue could not be blamed on outdated textbooks or a lack of access to information. It was something far deeper. The persistent inability to see the world as it is stems from the very architecture of the human mind. We are burdened with an overdramatic worldview, a stressful and highly misleading paradigm that dictates everything is deteriorating, resources are vanishing, and an impassable chasm divides the wealthy few from the destitute masses. This is the narrative predominantly amplified by the media, but the media is merely feeding a pre-existing appetite. The empirical, fact-based worldview reveals a vastly different reality, a world where the overwhelming majority of humanity lives in a functioning, advancing middle ground, facing immense challenges but demonstrating undeniable step-by-step progress. This propensity for drama is analogous to an optical illusion. Just as the brain systematically misinterprets the length of two identical lines, regardless of visual acuity or prior knowledge of the trick, it systematically misinterprets the state of the globe. These cognitive blind spots are evolutionary remnants. Our brains were forged over millions of years in small, hunter-gatherer societies where rapid, instinctual conclusions were vital for survival, and where a craving for drama, sugar, and fat meant the difference between life and death. Today, our unchecked cravings for caloric density lead to global health epidemics, and our unchecked cravings for dramatic narratives lead to an epidemic of devastating ignorance. We cannot surgically remove the emotional centers of our brains, for they are essential to a meaningful life. But we must consciously learn to moderate our intake of drama to prevent it from blinding us to reality. This endeavor is not merely about reciting statistics, it is about offering data as a form of therapy. Grasping the fact-based worldview is a profound source of mental peace, alleviating the chronic stress born of irrational fears. It acts as a cognitive diet and exercise regimen, equipping the mind to recognize sensationalism, control innate dramatic reflexes, and consistently perceive the world more accurately than our primate cousins. When I conclude a lecture by swallowing a bayonet, it is an extreme physical demonstration of a psychological necessity. Having just systematically dismantled an audience's preconceived notions of global misery, I swallow the blade to prove that what seems impossibly counterintuitive can be the absolute truth. The goal is not to shame individuals for their misconceptions, but to spark a childlike sense of wonder and curiosity. When we realize the world is profoundly better than we dared to imagine, the only appropriate response is a deeply inspired, "How is that even possible?" Replacing instinctual panic with critical thought allows us to step out of the circus tent and back into the world, grounded in reality and armed with a profound, justifiable hope. Chapter 1. The Gap Instinct, Where It All Started. In the autumn of 1995, during a seemingly ordinary university class, a lifelong crusade against global ignorance was unknowingly set into motion. The catalyst was a simple exercise involving global child mortality rates. The students were asked to guess the rate of child deaths in various nations. As they called out the figures for Saudi Arabia, Malaysia, Brazil, and Tanzania, the numbers were etched onto an overhead projector. These statistics, ranging from 14 to 171 deaths per 1,000 births, were not just cold digits. They functioned as a societal thermometer. They measured the profound fragility of life and the overarching health of an entire nation. If a country like Malaysia had a mortality rate of 14, it meant that an overwhelming majority of its children were successfully shielded from the myriad perils of early life, indicating a robust infrastructure of clean water, sufficient nutrition, and accessible healthcare. When the historical data was subsequently revealed, showing that Saudi Arabia had plummeted from an abysmal 242 child deaths per 1,000 in 1960 down to just 35, an improvement achieved at an astonishing pace. The room fell silent. The skepticism was palpable. Confronted with undeniable statistical evidence of monumental global progress, the students instinctively resisted the narrative. The empirical data clashed violently with the preconceived, static images they harbored in their minds. The mega misconception that the world is divided in two. This initial classroom encounter illuminated the most fundamental and pervasive cognitive trap that plagues human perception, the irresistible urge to bifurcate. It is the profound temptation to slice the vast complexity of human existence into two diametrically opposed camps, separated by an unbridgeable chasm of disparity. This cognitive reflex fosters the deeply entrenched belief that humanity is rigidly segregated into the wealthy and the impoverished. Tracking down such an overarching misconception is a formidable challenge, but that October evening provided the perfect opportunity to confront the intellectual beast head-on. This particular distortion of reality is exceptionally damaging because it completely warps an individual's sense of global proportion, establishing a foundation of falsehood upon which all other assumptions are built. Hunting down the first mega misconception. Resuming the dialogue, the reality of child mortality among isolated tribal and agricultural communities was discussed. While these desperate struggles were once the norm, the data proved that such horrific conditions were rapidly diminishing globally. Yet a student confidently asserted that they could never achieve the living standards of us, This simple, instinctive division sparked a profound interrogation. Who exactly constituted they? Was it the non-Western world? Did a rapidly advancing nation like Mexico belong to the West or the rest? The terminology immediately began to collapse under logical scrutiny. In a moment of creative problem-solving, another student proposed a quantifiable definition. The West consisted of small families with low child mortality, while the rest of the world consisted of large families with high child mortality. This suggestion was an absolute intellectual gift, for it transformed a nebulous emotional prejudice into a testable hypothesis. Armed with data tables and eventually colorful animated charts, the mission to systematically dismantle this binary worldview was formally launched. What's wrong with this picture? The labels developing and developed, or North and South, are ubiquitous in political, academic, and journalistic discourse. They effortlessly conjure the binary image of rich versus poor. If one were to plot the world according to the student's proposed metric, babies per woman against child survival rates, a graph from the mid-20th century would indeed validate this binary perspective. A cluster of nations with small families and high survival rates would sit far removed from a massive grouping of nations with large families and tragic mortality rates, separated by a vast, nearly unpopulated void. However, presenting such a paradigm today is akin to navigating a modern metropolis using a map drawn decades ago. The world has undergone a complete demographic metamorphosis. The contemporary reality reveals that the supposedly gaping void is now densely populated. The overwhelming majority of humanity resides in the space that once separated the extremes. Families have shrunk, and child survival has skyrocketed across the globe, including within the most populous nations on Earth. The antiquated notion of a divided world is a phantom lingering in the minds of the relatively affluent, unsupported by the overwhelming convergence seen in modern income, education, and health metrics. Capturing the beast. Encountering this stubborn misconception among educated, well-meaning individuals became a regular occurrence. Even highly esteemed journalists in advanced nations clung tenaciously to the belief in a small, affluent enclave separated from an impoverished global majority. To definitively capture this intellectual beast, a twofold trap was devised based on comprehensive public polling. First, individuals were asked to estimate the rate of girls completing primary school in low-income nations. The vast majority assumed a dismal figure, entirely ignorant of the fact that the majority of girls in these regions successfully finish their early education. The trap was then sprung by asking what percentage of the global population actually resides in these lowest income environments. The overwhelming consensus placed the figure at half the world or more. The stark reality is that less than 10% of humanity lives in such countries, and even within that fraction, life is significantly better than the catastrophic scenarios imagined by the public. The illusion of a divided world, dominated by mass deprivation, was systematically exposed as a profound fallacy. Help. The majority is missing. If the bulk of humanity does not reside in the lowest echelons of poverty, nor in the highest echelons of wealth, where do they exist? The answer lies in a category entirely absent from the binary mindset, the middle. The vast majority of the human race has successfully integrated into the global economy, achieving decent, steadily improving standards of living. By clinging to the illusion of universal stark poverty, one becomes blind to the billions of individuals who are steadily advancing, representing a monumental triumph of human resilience and a profound shift in the global landscape. So what should we call them instead? The 4 levels. Abandoning the obsolete terminology of developing and developed leaves a conceptual vacuum that must be filled with a more accurate framework. Instead of a false dichotomy, the global population is far better understood through a spectrum of 4 income levels. This paradigm shift is essential for making sense of the contemporary world. Level 1 represents the harsh reality of extreme poverty, where a daily struggle for basic physical survival consumes all energy. Water must be carried over long distances, meals are monotonous and meager, and a single illness can be fatal due to the absolute inability to afford medicine. Level 2 marks a significant leap where incomes have quadrupled. It is a life characterized by modest acquisitions, a bicycle, a gas stove, perhaps children attending school, yet it remains highly precarious where a sudden misfortune can plunge a family back into destitution. Level 3 brings further stability and expansion. With another quadrupling of income, households gain access to running water, reliable electricity, refrigeration, and motorized transport. Education extends into high school, and the concept of a vacation becomes a tangible reality. Level 4 is the domain of the affluent consumer. It is a life of relative luxury where basic needs are effortlessly met and additional income yields diminishing returns on daily comfort. Those inhabiting this echelon often struggle to grasp the profound disparities that exist among the other levels, perceiving everyone below them as a homogeneous mass of poverty. Human history is the epic story of an arduous climb from level 1 where everyone once languished. The supreme triumph of the modern era is that the majority of mankind has now secured a solid foothold in the middle, rendering the binary worldview entirely obsolete. The gap instinct. Despite overwhelming empirical evidence, the binary perspective remains fiercely resilient. Powerful global institutions took nearly 2 decades of persistent advocacy to officially abandon their outdated terminology. This stubborn resistance is deeply rooted in our innate psychological craving for dichotomy. The human mind is instinctively drawn to stark contrasts, good and evil, heroes and villains, profound wealth and utter destitution. The media expertly capitalizes on this instinct, framing narratives around conflict and extremes rather than the nuanced, steady progression of the vast majority. The gap instinct artificially polarizes our perception, creating the illusion of a vast chasm where a smooth continuum actually exists. How to control the gap instinct? To mitigate the distorting psychological effects of the gap instinct, one must remain relentlessly vigilant against narratives that emphasize extremes and artificial divisions. Comparisons of averages. Averages are indispensable analytical tools, yet they possess a subtle, inherent danger. They mask the vast spread of underlying data. When comparing the mathematical averages of 2 distinct groups, the mind effortlessly conjures a rigid gap between them. However, if one examines the full spectrum of individuals within those groups, the perceived gap almost invariably dissolves into a profound overlap. Whether comparing educational outcomes between genders or income distributions between neighboring nations, the true reality is rarely a story of complete separation, but rather one of significant undeniable convergence, comparisons of extremes. Human attention is naturally captivated by the most extreme examples available to our senses, the wealthiest global magnates and the most destitute famine victims, the most benevolent governments and the most ruthlessly oppressive regimes. While these extremes indisputably exist, they are absolutely not representative of the whole. Consistently highlighting the extremes creates a dramatic but deeply flawed portrait of reality, blinding us to the vast, complex, and heavily populated middle ground where the true narrative of human existence constantly unfolds. The view from up here. Those residing at the highest echelons of global income face a unique and dangerous cognitive challenge. From the towering vantage point of profound affluence, the subtle but vital distinctions among the less fortunate are easily lost. Looking down from a great height, everything below appears uniformly small. To an individual on level 4, the transformative differences between level 1, 2, and 3 can be entirely invisible, leading to the erroneous, arrogant conclusion that everyone else is simply poor. Recognizing this perspective distortion is absolutely crucial for cultivating an accurate, respectful, and empathetic understanding of global development. Factfulness. Ultimately, adopting a fact-based perspective requires recognizing the exact moment when the mind is being seduced by the illusion of a gap. It demands a conscious, disciplined effort to look beyond simplistic binaries and dramatic extremes to locate the silent, often overlooked majority that securely resides in the middle. By maintaining a healthy skepticism toward isolated averages, aggressively avoiding the emotional allure of extremes, and acknowledging the profound, distorting effects of one's own elevated perspective, it becomes possible to dismantle the overdramatic worldview and perceive the genuine progress of humanity with clarity and truth. Chapter 2. The Negativity Instinct, Getting Out of the Ditch. My earliest, most visceral memories are not of warmth or safety, but of being suddenly suspended upside down in the dark. I vividly recall the stifling stench of urine and the terrifying sensation of being entirely unable to breathe, as my mouth and nostrils packed with thick, foul mud. I remember thrashing in the sticky slurry, my tiny arms flailing blindly against the grass behind me, desperate for purchase, only to feel myself sinking deeper into the mire. And then the sudden, violent jerk of being hauled upward by my ankles. Afterward, there was my grandmother placing me into the large kitchen sink, gently washing the filth from my body with the hot water usually reserved for the dishes. The clean scent of soap followed the terror. These early memories, formed when I was just 4 years old, were very nearly my last. I had been rescued from the deep sewage ditch that ran directly in front of my grandmother's house, a trench filled with the runoff from the nearby factory workers' township, mixed with the previous night's heavy rain. Something shiny had caught my eye, and stepping too close to the precipice, I had tumbled in head first. My parents were not there to watch over me. My mother was confined to a hospital ward, suffering from tuberculosis, while my father labored 10 hours a day to support us. Throughout the week, I stayed with my grandparents. Weekends brought a different routine. My father would put me on the back rack of his bicycle, and we would ride in grand, joyful circles on our way to the hospital. Standing on the ground outside, I would look up to see my mother on the third-floor balcony, racked with coughs. My father gently explained that we could not go inside lest we catch her sickness, so I would wave to her, and she would wave back. I could see her lips moving, trying to speak to me, but her weakened voice was swallowed by the wind. What I remember most is that despite it all, she always tried to smile. The mega misconception that the world is getting worse. This chapter addresses our deeply ingrained negativity instinct, the psychological vulnerability that causes us to notice, remember, and amplify the bad while ignoring the good. This instinct fuels the second mega misconception that plagues human thought. Things are getting worse. It is the single most common declaration I encounter regarding the state of the world. To be clear, it is an undeniable reality that profound tragedies and severe threats exist. While war fatalities had been generally dropping since the Second World War, the horrific conflict in Syria has recently reversed that trend, and the spectre of terrorism is once again asserting itself. The relentless deterioration of our oceans and the devastating overfishing of marine life are causes for profound alarm. The registry of endangered species grows longer, and dead zones in our seas expand. Our climate is changing, the ice caps are melting, and sea levels will inevitably rise as a consequence of the greenhouse gases we have heedlessly pumped into the atmosphere. The financial collapse of 2007 demonstrated the staggering fragility of an economic system built on complex, poorly understood illusions of security, a system that remains vulnerable to another sudden crash. To confront these existential threats, to secure financial stability, to foster peace, to protect the natural world, we require unprecedented international cooperation. Such collaboration can only be built upon a foundation of shared, fact-based understanding. Therefore, our collective ignorance regarding the true state of the world is not merely an academic concern, it is the most perilous problem we face. The barrage of negative information is relentless. Whenever I challenge the pervasive gloom, people often assume I simply surround myself with overly pessimistic individuals. To test this, comprehensive polling was conducted across 30 countries, asking a simple question: do you think the world is getting better, getting worse, or staying about the same? The resulting data paints a remarkably clear and distressing picture. The overwhelming majority of humanity, from Turkey and Belgium to Mexico, South Korea, and the United States, firmly believes the world is deteriorating. It is little wonder that a pervasive sense of anxiety and stress defines our modern era. Statistics as therapy. It requires no effort to remain acutely aware of the world's miseries. It is significantly harder to maintain an awareness of the good. I'm not speaking of trivial, heartwarming human interest stories intended to artificially balance the grim headlines. I'm referring to the monumental, paradigm-shifting improvements that are too incremental, too slow, and too fragmented to ever be classified as breaking news. I am speaking of the profound, silent miracle of human progress. The foundational facts documenting this progress are so widely unknown that I am constantly invited to present them at global conferences. Audiences often describe my lectures as inspirational or comforting. Comfort was never my primary objective, yet the reaction is entirely logical. Because the prevailing worldview is so disproportionately negative, exposure to pure, unadulterated statistical reality functions as a potent form of therapy. It is genuinely comforting to realize that the world is dramatically better than you have been led to believe. It is a cognitive remedy available to anyone willing to look at the data. Extreme poverty. Consider the trajectory of extreme poverty. If you were asked how the proportion of the global population living in extreme poverty has changed over the last 20 years, would you guess that it has doubled, remained the same, or halved? The empirical reality is that over the past 2 decades, the proportion of people trapped in extreme poverty has almost halved. Yet, when polled, fewer than 1 in 10 people in most countries are aware of this monumental achievement. In the year 1800, roughly 85% of humanity existed in a state of extreme destitution. Across the globe, food insecurity was the norm. Going to bed hungry was a standard seasonal occurrence. Children in Britain were sent into the coal mines simply to earn their keep. A fifth of the Swedish population, including my own ancestors, fled the threat of mass starvation, boarding ships for the United States. When crops failed, the only recourse against death was migration. For the vast majority of human history, extreme poverty was not the exception. It was the inescapable rule. This grim reality held relatively constant until the mid-20th century. But look at the last 20 years. The drop in extreme poverty has been the most rapid in the history of our species. In 1997, 42% of the populations of both India and China lived in extreme poverty. By 2017, India had reduced that share to 12%, lifting 270 million individuals out of destitution. China reduced its share to a staggering 0.7%. Elevating another 500 million people past this critical threshold. Latin America saw a similar plummet from 14% to 4%. Take a moment to reflect on your own life 20 years ago, then consider this. 2 decades ago, 29% of the entire human race lived in extreme poverty. Today, that number is 9%. The greatest source of human suffering is on the verge of total eradication. We should be planning a global celebration for humanity. Instead, we remain entrenched in gloom. Blinded by the enduring images of misery on our screens, the relatively affluent individuals of the world have completely missed the reality that billions have quietly, steadily escaped the abyss. Life expectancy. Attempting to distill all human health, suffering, and mortality into a single metric is a formidable task, but average global life expectancy comes incredibly close. Every childhood illness, every maternal death, every fatal disaster, and every extended twilight of old age is mathematically captured in this one number. In 1800, as Swedish farmers starved and British children toiled in the dark, the global life expectancy hovered around 30 years. This had been the baseline for millennia. Roughly half of all children born perished before reaching adulthood. The survivors generally lived to be 50 to 70 years old, resulting in a mathematical average of 30. Today, the global average life expectancy is 72 years. Yet, when surveyed, highly educated audiences consistently guess the average to be 60 years, a figure that was accurate in 1973. In the 4 decades since, human life has been extended by more than a decade. We have always fought desperately for our families to survive, and finally, on a global scale, we are succeeding. When observing the historical curve of life expectancy, one undeniable plunge stands out. The year 1960. This was the year an estimated 15 to 40 million people starved to death in China during the most catastrophic man-made famine in history. A poor harvest coincided with disastrous agricultural mandates from the central government. Local officials, terrified of reporting failure, surrendered all remaining food to the state, leaving the rural population with nothing. The ensuing horrors of mass starvation and cannibalism were systematically hidden from the outside world for nearly 4 decades. Today, such an atrocity could not be kept secret, nor would the world stand idly by. Even if a government attempted to suppress the truth, institutions like the World Food Programme, which did not exist in 1960, would intervene. Understanding the horrific depths of our past makes it nearly impossible to sustain the illusion that the world is currently getting worse. We must never minimize contemporary tragedies, but placing them in historical context proves that the modern world is infinitely more transparent and capable of delivering vital aid. I was born in Egypt. My native Sweden is currently one of the wealthiest and healthiest nations on earth. However, it was not always this way. If we map the health and wealth of the world's countries today, we see a spectrum ranging from the poorest and sickest to the richest and healthiest, with the vast majority occupying the middle. If we trace Sweden's historical trajectory on this map, the transformation is staggering. The year I was born, 1948, Sweden occupied the exact position that Egypt holds today. Sweden was a middle-income nation where open sewage ditches were common and child drownings were frequent tragedies. By 1975, when my son was born, Sweden had advanced to the position currently held by Malaysia. Looking further back reveals even starker contrasts. When my mother was born in 1921, Sweden's living standards mirrored those of modern-day Zambia. When my grandmother was born in 1891, Sweden resembled Lesotho today, a nation on the precipice of extreme poverty. My grandmother spent her entire adult life hand-washing laundry for a family of 9, fetching water from outside. Yet she lived to see the miracle of development, ending her days with indoor plumbing. When my great-grandmother was born in 1863, Sweden was fundamentally equivalent to modern-day Afghanistan, locked in level 1 poverty. She would tell stories of surviving freezing winters on dirt floors. But the crucial realization is this: even the poorest citizens in Afghanistan today live significantly longer than Swedes did in 1863, because the foundational advancements of the modern era, basic sanitation, vaccinations, plastic containers for safe water transport, have reached nearly every corner of the globe. Your country has experienced a similar miraculous ascent. Every single nation has radically improved its life expectancy and living standards over the last 2 centuries. 32. More improvements. If the persistent illusion of a deteriorating world still holds your mind captive, you must confront the overwhelming data. The evidence of progress extends far beyond basic economic and mortality metrics. Consider the terrible afflictions that are steadily vanishing from the human experience. Legal slavery, once practiced globally, is virtually eradicated. The volume of oil spilled into our oceans has plummeted. The cost of solar energy has dropped precipitously. The rate of new HIV infections has steeply declined. The percentage of children dying before their 5th birthday is a fraction of its historical norm. Battle deaths have fallen dramatically since the mid-20th century. The death penalty is being systematically abolished worldwide. Leaded gasoline, a profound neurotoxin, is entirely phased out. Fatalities from commercial plane crashes and natural disasters have reached historic lows. The horrors of child labor are rapidly diminishing. The global stockpile of nuclear weapons has been drastically reduced. Smallpox has been erased from existence. Simultaneously, the markers of human flourishing are surging upward. The production of culture, from new movies to recorded music, has exploded. The percentage of the Earth's surface designated as protected nature reserves has grown exponentially. Women's right to vote, a rarity a century ago, is nearly universal. Scientific publication is accelerating at an unprecedented rate. Global harvests yield vastly more food per hectare. The percentage of adults possessing basic literacy has skyrocketed. The majority of humanity now lives under democratic governance. The survival rate for childhood cancer has improved miraculously. The proportion of girls attending primary school has achieved near parity with boys. Access to electricity, improved water sources, mobile technology, and the internet is expanding at breakneck speed. Global immunization reaches the vast majority of the world's infants. These improvements are often invisible from the vantage point of affluence, occurring gradually beyond our immediate horizon. But the ultimate metric of this progress is not merely wealth or longevity. It is the freedom to shape our own destinies. It is the child who, shielded from preventable disease, is now free to learn to play an instrument. Culture and freedom are the true dividends of human development, and by every measurable standard, they are multiplying. The negativity instinct. Why, in the face of such overwhelming evidence of progress, do we instinctively believe the opposite? The negativity instinct is a complex psychological mechanism driven by three primary forces: the romanticization of the past, the selective nature of modern reporting, and the emotional conflation of acknowledging progress with ignoring suffering. Warning: objects in your memories were worse than they appear. It is a universal human tendency for older generations to romanticize their youth and lament the state of the modern world. However, this nostalgia is fundamentally flawed. The past was objectively more brutal, impoverished, and dangerous. Yet, human memory is remarkably adept at shedding the trauma of historical deprivation. In the West, only the very elderly retain visceral memories of the Great Depression or the World Wars. In rapidly advancing nations like India and China, the visceral reality of mass starvation just 2 generations ago has been largely forgotten by a rising middle class, now preoccupied with modern concerns. When confronted with photographic evidence of their own impoverished past, villagers often deny it, unable to reconcile the visual proof of their former destitution with their current, improved reality. Beyond living memory, humanity actively suppresses the horrors of its history. Ancient burial sites reveal the grim truth: vast numbers of children killed by disease, starvation, and violence. In stark contrast, child graves are a rarity in modern cemeteries. The past was a nightmare we eagerly forget, leading us to falsely assume the present is uniquely terrible. Selective reporting. We are subjected to an unyielding daily avalanche of negative information: wars, corruption, natural disasters, epidemics, and economic crises. The architecture of modern media guarantees this. A journalist who consistently reported on the millions of flights that landed safely, or the crops that did not fail, would swiftly find themselves unemployed. Gradual, incremental improvements, even those that transform the lives of billions, simply do not meet the criteria for breaking news. Furthermore, the expansion of press freedom and the ubiquity of communication technology mean that we are now hyper-aware of suffering that would have previously gone unnoticed. Centuries ago, the eradication of entire indigenous populations or mass famines in distant lands barely registered in the global consciousness. Today, a natural disaster anywhere on Earth is broadcast instantaneously into our living rooms. Our surveillance of human misery has reached unprecedented levels. While this heightened awareness is a testament to moral progress, it paradoxically creates the optical illusion that the world is spiraling into chaos. Activists and lobbyists capitalize on this, framing every localized dip in a positive trend as a catastrophic apocalypse. For instance, violent crime in the United States has been dropping steadily since 1990, yet a continuous stream of sensationalized reporting ensures that the majority of citizens consistently believe crime is rising. Feeling, not thinking. When individuals assert that the world is getting worse, they are often not engaging in rational analysis. They are expressing a profound emotional reaction. Acknowledging that the world is improving can feel inherently callous, as though one is dismissing the genuine, ongoing suffering of millions. When I present the data of global progress, I am frequently branded an optimist. I resent the label, as it implies a naive, irrational cheerfulness. I am not an optimist. I am a possibilist. A possibilist refuses to hope without reason or fear without reason. A possibilist maintains a relentless resistance to the overdramatic worldview. Acknowledging that monumental progress has been achieved does not mean ignoring the fact that planes still crash, children still die from preventable diseases, and despots still rule. We must remain deeply vigilant. However, denying the reality of human progress is not just factually incorrect, it is dangerous. If we convince ourselves that all past efforts to improve the world have failed, we risk plunging into apathy or supporting reckless radical interventions when proven methodical strategies are already working. Consider the education of girls. It is perhaps the single most effective catalyst for societal transformation, leading to diversified workforces, lower child mortality, and smaller, healthier families. Historically, extreme poverty forced parents to prioritize the education of boys. Today, thanks to immense global effort, 90% of girls of primary school age are enrolled, nearly equal to the 92% enrollment rate for boys. We must absolutely continue to fight for the remaining marginalized girls, but to deny the astonishing progress already achieved is to rob ourselves of the very hope required to finish the job. How to control the negativity instinct. Dismantling the negativity instinct does not involve artificially balancing negative news with happy stories. That approach merely replaces one delusion with another. The true antidote requires developing the cognitive discipline to hold two seemingly contradictory truths simultaneously, bad and better. Consider the analogy of a prematurely born infant in a neonatal intensive care unit. The child's condition is critical. Her life hangs by a thread. However, day by day, her vital signs show steady, measurable improvement. Is the baby's condition bad? Yes, it is terrible. Is her condition improving? Yes, undeniably. Recognizing that the situation is getting better does not mean the child is safe, nor does it mean the doctors should cease their vigilance. This is exactly how we must view the world. The state of humanity is both bad and getting better. We do not have to choose between acknowledging profound global challenges and celebrating profound global progress. Both realities exist concurrently. Expect bad news. We must cultivate a mental armor against the relentless onslaught of negative reporting. We must consciously remember that the media ecosystem thrives on drama and anomalies. A localized crisis will always generate more headlines than a steady, long-term improvement. When confronted with a terrifying headline, we must pause and ask ourselves, if an equally significant positive development had occurred, would it have generated the same level of media attention? The answer is almost always no. The silent miracles of human progress, the children who do not drown, the diseases that do not spread, the harvests that do not fail, will never be broadcast. We must actively seek out the data to find the positive trends, whereas the negative news will always find us effortlessly. Understanding this inherent bias is essential for maintaining our psychological equilibrium in a hyper-connected world. Don't censor history. We must actively resist the urge to sanitize the past. Confronting the unvarnished, brutal reality of historical human existence is necessary. It shatters the illusion of a lost golden age and provides the essential context required to appreciate the staggering comforts and safeties of the modern era. Understanding the true depths of historical misery is the ultimate source of fact-based hope, proving that humanity possesses the capacity to overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges. I would like to thank society. When I was thrashing in that sewage ditch 65 years ago, I possessed no knowledge of global health metrics or demographic trends. I was simply a terrified child choking on filth. My survival that day was secured by the immediate physical intervention of my grandmother. But my ultimate survival and the trajectory of my entire life was secured by the immense structural progress of Swedish society. During my lifetime, Sweden ascended from a struggling level 3 nation to an affluent level 4 nation. Medical advancements cured my mother's tuberculosis. A robust public infrastructure provided the libraries that educated me, the universities that trained me as a physician, and the world-class healthcare system that later saved me from cancer, all without direct financial cost to my family. My journey from that working-class ditch to the global stage at Davos was not a solitary triumph. It was a testament to the power of societal development. Today, because Sweden has achieved level 4 prosperity, the horrific child mortality rates of the past are a distant memory. Child drownings, once a common tragedy, have been virtually eliminated through societal investments in fences, swimming lessons, and lifeguards. This systemic eradication of suffering is the true definition of progress. And the profound realization is that this exact same mechanism of improvement is currently accelerating across the globe, transforming the destinies of billions at a pace that far exceeds Sweden's historical ascent. Factfulness. Practicing factfulness means recognizing the moment when the mind is being hijacked by negative information. It requires the conscious realization that our perception of the world is systematically skewed toward the dramatic and the terrifying. By expecting bad news, distinguishing between a current state of bad and a trajectory of better, acknowledging the invisibility of gradual improvement and rejecting the false nostalgia of a romanticized past, we can conquer the negativity instinct. This discipline frees us from unwarranted despair and equips us with the clear-eyed, fact-based resolve necessary to continue improving the world. Chapter 3. The Straight Line. Instinct numbers and data have the profound capacity to induce absolute terror. In the early autumn of 2014, while sitting at my desk in Stockholm, I encountered a statistical trajectory that paralyzed me with genuine fear. For weeks, the world had watched the Ebola outbreak in West Africa with growing unease, witnessing tragic scenes from the streets of Monrovia. Working in global health, one becomes somewhat accustomed to sudden outbreaks of lethal pathogens, and I had initially assumed this crisis would be contained like so many before it. But the data, compiled by the World Health Organization, dismantled that comforting assumption in an instant. The data revealed that the infection rate was not climbing steadily along a predictable linear path. Instead, the numbers were multiplying exponentially. Each victim was passing the virus to 2 others before succumbing to the disease. The transmission followed a terrifying sequence of doubling: 1, 2, 4, 8, 16. This meant the total number of new cases was doubling every 3 weeks. I was reminded of the ancient Indian legend of the chessboard, where a single grain of rice placed on the first square is doubled on the next, until the sheer volume of grain threatens to bury the entire nation. An exponential curve is a monstrous force. It meant that within a mere 2 months, the crisis would be 8 times as severe. Liberia was standing on the precipice of a catastrophe that could dwarf its recent civil war, with the potential to easily cross oceans hidden inside the bodies of asymptomatic travelers. Recognizing the mathematical reality of the doubling curve forced me out of my office and onto an airplane. I cancelled all my professional commitments, left my family, and spent the next 3 months in Liberia, utilizing my decades of experience with rural African epidemics to help combat the crisis. I had initially failed to grasp the magnitude of the danger because my mind had instinctively projected the infection numbers along a comforting, straight line. Understanding the true shape of the curve was the catalyst for urgent, necessary action. However, this deeply ingrained human tendency to assume that a trend will simply continue along a straight trajectory is also the source of one of our most pervasive and damaging global misunderstandings. This brings us to the third massive cognitive distortion, the conviction that the global human population is just increasing. The danger in this belief lies entirely within the word just. While it is an undeniable fact that the population is currently growing at a rapid pace, adding roughly 1 billion individuals every 13 years, the assumption that this growth is an unstoppable linear force is fundamentally false. The word just implies a runaway train that requires drastic emergency intervention to halt. The depth of this fallacy was vividly illustrated to me during a conference of educators in Norway. I presented these teachers, many of whom taught global social sciences, with a fundamental demographic question regarding the United Nations projections for the year 2100. I asked them to identify the future trajectory of the global population of children. Today, there are approximately 2 billion children in the world. According to the UN, how many will there be at the end of the century? The empirical, undisputed answer is 2 billion. The curve of child population has already flattened. It is not expected to rise. Yet, only a dismal fraction of the educators, less than 1 in 10, selected the correct answer. The overwhelming majority believed the number of children would climb to 3 or 4 billion. Even the intellectual elite gathered at Davos fared poorly, failing to outscore a hypothetical chimpanzee throwing darts at the possible answers. The fact that the number of children in the world has stopped growing is the most vital demographic reality of our time. Yet it remains a profound global secret. To understand why the straight-line instinct is so alluring, we must look back to the dawn of agriculture. 10,000 years ago, the entire human race consisted of roughly 5 million individuals, fewer than the population of a single modern metropolis. For millennia, this number crept upward at an imperceptible pace, finally reaching 1 billion around the year 1800. Then the trajectory skyrocketed. The second billion arrived in just over a century, and the next 5 billion materialized in less than 100 years. Looking at a historical graph of human population, the curve shoots upward with such violence that the brain cannot help but extend the line infinitely into the heavens. We are biologically hardwired to calculate straight lines. If a stone is thrown at your head, your brain effortlessly calculates its linear trajectory, allowing you to duck out of the way. This visual forecasting was essential for ancestral survival and remains vital for navigating modern traffic. But applying this intuitive physics to complex global demographics leads to absurd conclusions. Consider the growth of a newborn child. My own grandson measured just under 20 inches at birth and grew a staggering 7 inches in his first 6 months. If one were to project that rate of growth forward along a straight line, he would be a 5-foot-tall toddler and a 13-foot-tall 10-year-old. We immediately recognize the absurdity of a linear growth chart for a human body because we have lifelong experience with human development. We intuitively know that growth slows and eventually plateaus. Our straight-line instinct fails us regarding global population only because we lack an intuitive understanding of global demographics. If the number of children in the world is no longer increasing, how do we explain the UN's certainty that the total population will continue to grow by several billion before finally stabilizing between 10 and 12 billion at the end of the century? The answer is not an explosion of new births, nor is it merely the elderly living drastically longer lives. The growth is driven by an unavoidable demographic fill-up effect. Visualize the current global population divided by age. We have a massive base of children and young adults, and progressively smaller tiers of older adults above them. In the coming decades, the current 2 billion children will grow into adults, replacing the smaller, older generation. They will, in turn, have their own 2 billion children. This massive cohort of youth will simply age through the system, filling out the upper echelons of the population pyramid over the next 3 generations. The explosive growth we are experiencing is a delayed echo of the past, the inevitable maturing of the babies already born. Once this demographic wave completes its life cycle, the total population will stabilize. For the vast majority of human history, our species existed in a brutal balance with nature. Women historically birthed an average of 6 children, but devastating mortality rates ensured that only 2 survived to replace their parents. The population remained flat, not through harmony, but through the relentless tragedy of child death. As humanity began to escape extreme poverty over the last 2 centuries, the death rate plummeted, but the birth rate remained temporarily high. This gap between falling mortality and high fertility created the population explosion. Today, humanity has entered a new, beautiful equilibrium. The global average is now roughly 2.5 children per woman. Parents no longer need to produce large families as agricultural laborers, nor do they need to hedge against the horrific likelihood of their children dying in infancy. As extreme poverty is eradicated, as women gain access to education, and as modern contraceptives become widely available, family sizes naturally and inevitably shrink. Yet the straight-line instinct often conspires with cultural prejudice. People frequently argue that the population will never stabilize because certain religions, continents, or cultures inherently demand massive families. The media feeds this distortion by highlighting extreme, unrepresentative examples of massive religious households, but the data entirely dismantles this cultural myth. When you examine the families living on the higher income levels, whether they reside in Iran, Mexico, Bangladesh, or Brazil, and regardless of their faith, the average family size is 2 children. The only demographic that consistently produces large families of 5 or more children are those still trapped in the absolute destitution of extreme poverty. Large families are not a cultural symptom, they are an economic symptom of level 1 poverty. The moral and practical imperative therefore aligns perfectly. Eradicating extreme poverty and saving children's lives is not just a humanitarian duty, it is the exact mechanism required to halt global population growth. Consider the profound transformation of Bangladesh. In the early 1970s, it was a nation defined by misery, with women having an average of 7 children and life expectancy hovering in the low 50s. Through relentless, methodical investments in female education, vaccinations, and basic health care, child survival skyrocketed. Today, Bangladeshi women have an average of 2 children, and life expectancy mirrors that of an advanced nation. A similar miracle unfolded in Egypt, where devastating child mortality rates in the 1960s were conquered through infrastructure and healthcare, leading to a stabilization of family size. The survival of children is the prerequisite for a stable world population. Ultimately, maintaining a fact-based worldview requires the mental discipline to recognize that the universe rarely operates in straight lines. While a few metrics, like the correlation between wealth and education, do follow a roughly linear path, most global phenomena trace entirely different shapes. Many advancements follow an S-curve, starting slowly, accelerating rapidly as a technology or practice, like basic literacy or refrigeration, becomes accessible, and then flattening out once universal adoption is reached. Other trends follow a slide shape, such as the global fertility rate, which dropped precipitously before leveling out at the replacement rate. Still others form a hump, rising during early industrialization before falling as societies gain the wealth to implement safety regulations, much like the trajectory of traffic fatalities or dental cavities. Practicing factfulness means recognizing the specific moment when you are assuming a trend will continue indefinitely along a straight path. It requires the conscious realization that straight lines are geometric anomalies in a complex world. By demanding to see the full curve, and by understanding the underlying forces driving the data, we can free ourselves from the panic of exponential illusions and the despair of infinite population growth, allowing us to face the future with calm, analytical clarity. Chapter 4. The Fear Instinct Blood All Over the Floor. In the autumn of 1975, the emergency room of a Swedish hospital became the stage for a profound lesson in how terror warps human perception. As a young physician, I was attending to a patient when an assistant nurse burst through the doors, her voice trembling, announcing that an airplane had crashed and the pilot was being rushed in. Minutes later, I faced a man speaking in frantic, unintelligible syllables, his body shivering uncontrollably. As I looked down, I saw what appeared to be a horrifying amount of blood covering the floor beneath him. My mind instantly bypassed all logical medical assessment and leaped to the darkest, most terrifying conclusion. Given the geopolitical tensions of the Cold War era, my lifelong, deep-seated dread of a Third World War hijacked my senses. I looked at the pilot and concluded, with absolute certainty, that he was a Russian fighter pilot shot down over Swedish territory. The incomprehensible babble must be Russian. The immense volume of fluid on the floor must be a fatal hemorrhage. In my mind, the apocalypse had begun, and I was completely paralyzed by the sheer horror of the moment. Deliverance came not from a sudden realization on my part, but through the calm intervention of the head nurse. Returning from her lunch break, she quickly assessed the situation, entirely unburdened by panic. She scolded me for nearly destroying the pilot's incredibly expensive military G-suit. She then pointed out that I was stepping on a broken dye cartridge from the suit's life jacket, which was leaking red ink, not blood, all over the floor. Turning to the patient, she spoke to him gently in Swedish, explaining that his violent shivering and chattering teeth, the source of the Russian babble, was simply the result of severe hypothermia from spending 23 minutes in the freezing ocean after a routine flight went wrong. Everything I thought I saw was completely inverted by my own panic. The Russian enemy was a local Swedish pilot. The onset of global warfare was a time of peace. A fatal hemorrhage was a broken ink cartridge. Yet, in those agonizing minutes, the illusion felt as undeniable as gravity. This experience etched a permanent truth into my understanding of the human mind. Critical thinking is fundamentally incompatible with intense fear. When terror occupies our consciousness, there is simply no space left for the quiet, methodical processing of facts. The attention filter. To navigate the immense complexity of existence without being completely overwhelmed, the human brain relies on a sophisticated attention filter. This psychological shield protects us from an infinite barrage of sensory input, sorting the vital from the trivial. However, this filter is far from an objective lens. It is heavily punctuated with vulnerabilities left over from our evolutionary past, and it disproportionately allows through information that resonates with our deepest, most primal, dramatic instincts. News of a gradual, steady decline in global disease or a perfectly accurate weather forecast effortlessly bounces off this shield. Such events lack the sudden, sharp edge of drama. Conversely, stories involving natural disasters, outbreaks of war, terrifying illnesses, and acts of terror pierce the filter effortlessly. These are the extraordinary anomalies, yet because they are the only pieces of information that consistently capture our focus, they paint a deeply misleading portrait in our minds. The media industry operates almost entirely around the contours of this attention filter. Journalists are well aware that to capture and retain public attention, they must broadcast the exceptional and the terrifying. Never before in human history has comprehensive data regarding global progress been more accessible, yet never before has the broadcast of danger been so pervasive. The consequence is a society saturated with information but starving for perspective. We end up assuming that the highly unusual tragedies we constantly observe are representative of everyday reality, cementing an overdramatic and fundamentally frightening worldview. Fear versus danger, being afraid of the right things. To dismantle this overdramatic worldview, we must clearly separate two concepts that our instincts constantly conflate: fear and danger. Fear is an emotional, subjective response to a perceived threat. Danger is a cold, calculable reality. The human mind is biologically hardwired to fear physical violence, captivity, and invisible contamination. For our ancient ancestors, and for those still struggling in extreme poverty today, these fears are highly practical. A traditional midwife laboring in rural Africa rightly desires a flashlight above all else, simply to avoid deadly snake bites in the dark. But for the vast majority of humanity living in advanced societies, these ancient biological alarms are overwhelmingly obsolete. When we confuse what is frightening with what is actually dangerous, we tragically misallocate our compassion and our resources. Consider the profound fear of natural disasters or airplane crashes. Commercial aviation today is a marvel of human safety, a testament to decades of international collaboration following the Chicago Convention, which standardized global incident reporting. Millions of flights land safely every single year, yet a solitary, tragic crash will dominate global headlines, masking the reality of unprecedented safety. Similarly, the profound fear of invisible contamination, a modern echo of our ancient fear of poison, drives devastating choices. During the Fukushima disaster, it was not the radiation that claimed the lives of over 1,000 victims, but the frantic, stress-inducing evacuation driven by pure terror. This same chemophobia causes highly educated parents to refuse life-saving vaccinations, exposing their children to genuine, lethal dangers like measles because they are paralyzed by the perceived, terrifying risk of the vaccine itself. Terrorists understand this psychological vulnerability perfectly. Their entire strategy relies on bypassing rational risk assessment to inflict maximum psychological trauma, even though the actual statistical danger they pose in wealthy nations is dwarfed by the everyday tragedy of alcohol-related fatalities. While the world's attention is captivated by terrifying anomalies, the silent, massive killers go unnoticed. During the immediate aftermath of a highly publicized earthquake in Nepal that tragically claimed thousands of lives, an equal number of children quietly perished across the globe from preventable diarrhea. Because their deaths lacked the dramatic spectacle of a collapsing building, they did not pierce the global attention filter. We must aggressively resist the urge to let panic dictate our priorities. A fact-based worldview demands that we suppress the blinding noise of our fears and evaluate the genuine risks that threaten human flourishing. Factfulness. Practicing a fact-based perspective requires the constant, conscious recognition that frightening information commands our attention by design. We must internalize the reality that the world feels vastly more dangerous than it actually is, because the information that reaches us has been meticulously curated for its terrifying impact. To master the fear instinct, one must calculate the actual risk, understanding that genuine peril is determined not by the intensity of the fear it provokes, but by a simple equation: the severity of the danger multiplied by one's actual exposure to it. Finally, cultivating this worldview demands the discipline to recognize when panic has taken hold, and the resolve to make no significant decisions until that fear has subsided. By deliberately allowing our minds to cool, we restore our capacity for analytical thought, ensuring that our actions are guided by reality rather than the haunting illusions of our ancient anxieties. Chapter 6. The Generalization Instinct. Dinner is served. An orange sun was setting behind the acacia trees on the savanna of the Bandundu region, situated half a day's walk beyond the end of the paved road south of the Congo River. This remote landscape is home to individuals living in extreme poverty, effectively isolated behind the mountains where the infrastructure abruptly halts. My colleague Thorkild and I had spent the entire day conducting nutritional interviews with the villagers, and to honor our unprecedented visit, they had prepared a feast. In a gesture of profound gratitude and respect, much like Swedish villagers might have done a century ago, they presented us with the most magnificent meat they could procure. As the entire village formed an expectant circle around us, we were handed plates lined with large green leaves. Resting on top were 2 whole skinned and grilled rats. Fighting back nausea, I noticed that Thorkild, driven by the intense hunger of a long day's work, had already begun eating. Surrounded by the hopeful, smiling faces of our hosts, I realized I had no choice. I took a bite, and to my surprise, it tasted remarkably like chicken. I forced a polite smile and swallowed, but the trial had only just begun. Next came dessert, plates piled high with massive white palm nut tree lavas. Each lava was thicker than my thumb, lightly fried in its own fat. My stomach churned as I noticed that they had perhaps been too lightly fried, for the creatures still seemed to be moving. Their heads resembled small brown nuts, and their thick, transparent bodies looked like wrinkled marshmallows, displaying their internal organs clearly. The villagers enthusiastically gestured for me to bite them in half and suck out the insides. I knew that if I attempted this, the rat would inevitably come back up. Yet as a guest, offending them was unthinkable. Desperation sparked an idea. I smiled regretfully and explained that I simply could not eat the lavas. The villagers looked puzzled, immediately pointing to Thorkild, who was happily devouring them, with lavas hanging from the corners of his mouth. he had been a missionary in the Congo, where these insects were the highlight of his week. Thinking quickly, I explained that Thorkild and I belonged to different tribes. He was from Denmark, where larvas were a beloved delicacy, whereas I was from Sweden, where consuming them was strictly against our culture. The village teacher retrieved a world map, and I pointed to the body of water dividing our two nations, cementing the lie. It was one of the most blatant fabrications of my life, but it worked flawlessly. The villagers happily shared my dessert among themselves, completely satisfied by the explanation. It is a universally understood concept. People from different tribes naturally have different customs. The generalization instinct. Human beings possess a relentless, unconscious drive to categorize and generalize everything we encounter. This is not a matter of prejudice or enlightenment, it is a fundamental biological necessity. Categories provide the essential architecture for our thoughts. If we perceived every single item, event, or scenario as entirely unique, the world would be an overwhelming chaos, and we would lack even the basic language required to describe our surroundings. However, this deeply ingrained and necessary instinct to generalize carries a profound risk. It can severely distort our worldview. It frequently compels us to mistakenly bundle together people, objects, or nations that are fundamentally vastly different. It tricks us into assuming that every entity within a given category is identical. Most dangerously, it drives us to jump to sweeping conclusions about an entire group based on a few, or even just one, highly unusual example. The media expertly exploits this instinct, utilizing misleading generalizations and stereotypes as a communicative shorthand. We are constantly fed simplified archetypes: the gang member, the supermom, the rural farmer. When a generalization becomes widely recognized as problematic, we label it a stereotype. While gender and racial stereotypes rightfully command our attention due to the severe harm they cause, they are not the only dangerous generalizations. Flawed categories act as impenetrable mind blockers that sabotage our understanding of reality. Just as the gap instinct artificially divides the world into us and them, the generalization instinct convinces us that everyone within the them category is a homogeneous mass. If you work in a global commercial enterprise and rely on obsolete generalizations like the developing world, you operate under the delusion that billions of people are entirely destitute. Consequently, you remain entirely blind to the massive emerging middle-class markets, foolishly misallocating your resources while the greatest economic opportunity in human history passes you by. To combat these mind blockers, one must confront reality firsthand. The most potent antidote to misleading categories is travel. I regularly took my privileged medical students from Stockholm on study trips to regions like Kerala in India or Kampala in Uganda. Expecting uniform destitution, they were consistently shocked to find organized cities with traffic lights and functioning infrastructure. Upon visiting a local hospital, they would observe peeling paint and crowded wards, instantly generalizing the facility as hopelessly impoverished. I had to correct their categorization. People in actual extreme poverty have no hospitals whatsoever. They give birth on mud floors with untrained midwives. The hospital's peeling paint was not a sign of absolute poverty, but a strategic decision. By avoiding cosmetic upgrades, the hospital intentionally deterred wealthy patients who demand costly, time-consuming treatments, thereby preserving their limited resources to provide cost-effective care to the maximum number of people. When my students then encountered a patient whose diabetes could be accurately diagnosed, but who could not afford the life-saving insulin, their simplistic categories of rich and poor health systems were entirely shattered. Reality simply refused to fit into their generalized boxes. My first time. I am no less susceptible to these cognitive errors than my students. In 1972, as a young fourth-year medical student, I spent time studying at a medical school in Bangalore, India. During my very first class, we were examining kidney X-rays. I immediately recognized a clear case of kidney cancer, but chose to remain silent, wanting to observe out of respect and avoid appearing arrogant. Suddenly, the hands of the Indian students shot up. One by one, they articulated precise diagnoses, detailed the typical pathways of metastasis and outlined the most advanced treatment protocols. Their knowledge was encyclopedic, matching what I expected from chief physicians. Stunned, I concluded that I had wandered into the wrong room and was sitting among highly trained specialists. As the class concluded, I turned to a neighboring student and confessed that I was supposed to be with the fourth years. "That's us," he replied. I was paralyzed with disbelief. Looking at their caste marks and the tropical palm trees outside, my deeply entrenched generalization that the West was inherently intellectually and scientifically superior to the rest collapsed. I soon discovered that these students studied from textbooks 3 times as thick as mine and read them 3 times as often. That moment in Bangalore was the first time I was violently forced to update my worldview. I realized with absolute clarity that the Western monopoly on progress was a temporary illusion and that the rest of the world would inevitably catch up. How to control the generalization? Instinct. If traversing the globe is not an option, you must actively deploy mental tools to prevent your brain from relying on flawed categories. Find better categories. Dollar Street. It is not enough to simply discard old categories. They must be replaced with accurate ones. The most effective way to understand global living conditions is not to group people by their nationality or culture, but by their income level. To make this visible, the Dollar Street Project was created, documenting the everyday lives of families across the 4 income levels worldwide. Consider the Salhi family living in Tunisia. They reside in a house with a raw, half-built second floor. A Western observer relying on cultural generalizations might look at the unfinished construction and conclude that Tunisians are disorganized, lazy, or that the builders simply abandoned the job. However, applying the generalization instinct across different income levels is a massive analytical failure. The Salis, like millions of others on levels 2 and 3, lack access to secure banking and reliable credit. If they save cash to improve their home, they risk losing it to rampant inflation or theft. Therefore, whenever they accumulate surplus money, they immediately purchase actual bricks. The bricks hold their value against inflation, and when cemented onto the existing structure, cannot be stolen. Over the course of a decade, they incrementally build a better home. Rather than generalizing based on a perceived cultural flaw, we must assume that people are intelligent. When confronted with behavior that appears strange or irrational, the analytical mind must ask, in what way is this actually a brilliant and logical solution to a problem I do not yet understand? This discipline of questioning categories must also extend to how we apply rules across different groups. We must fiercely beware of generalizing from one group to another. In 1974, a sweeping generalization in the medical community cost thousands of lives. It had been established that unconscious soldiers must be placed on their stomachs to prevent them from choking on their own vomit. Tragically, this logic was generalized and applied to healthy, sleeping infants. Doctors, including myself, confidently instructed parents to put their babies to sleep on their stomachs. However, a sleeping infant is not an unconscious soldier. While a baby on its back possesses the reflexes to turn its head if it vomits, a baby on its stomach may lack the neck strength to keep its airway open. This flawed generalization directly fueled the epidemic of sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS. The evidence to reverse this deadly advice was available long before the medical community accepted it. We must tirelessly scrutinize our logic to uncover the hidden, sweeping generalizations that obscure the truth and cause catastrophic harm. Factfulness. Practicing. Factfulness means recognizing the exact moment when a category is being used to explain a phenomenon and remaining acutely aware that categories can be profoundly deceptive. We cannot eradicate the instinct to generalize, but we can master it by relentlessly questioning the boxes we construct. To control the generalization instinct, you must actively search for significant differences within large groups and actively look for striking similarities across seemingly different groups. You must never assume that a rule or behavior applicable to one group naturally translates to another. You must maintain a deep skepticism of the term majority, demanding to know whether it represents a barely there 51% or an overwhelming 99%. You must remain vigilant against vivid, exceptional examples that your mind attempts to weaponize as the general rule. Ultimately, cultivating a fact-based worldview requires the fundamental humility to assume that people are not idiots, trusting that their actions are rational responses to the complex realities of the levels on which they live. Chapter 7. The Destiny Instinct. Following a lecture detailing the immense progress in education and child survival across African nations such as Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Ghana, the audience's reaction was overwhelmingly engaged. Yet, as the equipment was being packed away, a grey-haired gentleman in a lightly checked three-piece suit approached the stage. With a polite smile, he casually dismissed every statistic presented. Drawing on his past service in Nigeria, he confidently declared that there was not a snowball's chance in hell that Africa would ever build a modern society. He blamed their intrinsic culture, insisting it would hold them back forever. Before a factual, data-driven response could even be formulated, he patted his listener on the shoulder and walked away to fetch a cup of tea. This gentleman's absolute certainty perfectly illustrates the destiny instinct, the profound and erroneous belief that innate, unchanging characteristics dictate the ultimate fates of people, nations, religions, and cultures. This cognitive trap insists that things are the way they are for inescapable reasons, and that because they have always been this way, they will never change. From an evolutionary standpoint, it is easy to see how this instinct developed. Historically, humans inhabited static environments where learning how things worked and assuming they would remain that way was a vital survival strategy. Furthermore, claiming a unique, unalterable destiny for one's own tribe fostered unity and a comforting sense of superiority over others. Today, however, this instinct to view societies as petrified and unyielding severely blinds us to the rapid, revolutionary cultural and economic transformations occurring constantly around us. Societies and cultures are not rocks. They are in perpetual motion. While Western cultures continuously evolve, non-Western cultures are moving as well, and frequently at a much faster pace. These cultural shifts often happen just slowly enough to escape the daily news cycle, but fast enough to completely remake a society over a single generation. One of the most common manifestations of this destiny instinct is the conviction that Africa is fundamentally unable to catch up with the rest of the world. While it is true that the African continent currently lags behind global averages with a life expectancy of 65 years, relying on a solitary continental average obscures massive internal progress. Several large African nations, including Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Libya, and Egypt, already boast life expectancies that exceed the global average. The assumption that the entire continent is trapped in an inescapable cycle of poverty is an illusion built on feeling rather than fact. For global businesses operating under this outdated paradigm, this destiny instinct is actively destructive. By assuming that these populations will always remain destitute, multinational corporations are entirely blind to the largest expansion of the middle-income consumer market in human history, currently unfolding across Africa and Asia. While Western companies remain asleep, local brands are aggressively securing market share. This same destiny instinct creates profound misunderstandings regarding the intersection of religion and demographics. During a global health course in 1998, a student of Iranian descent approached the lecturer in tears. She explained that a brief presentation of United Nations data regarding Iran's rapid advancements in health and education was the first positive thing she had ever heard anyone in Sweden say about her people. The data revealed an astounding reality. Iran had experienced the fastest drop in birth rates in recorded history, plummeting from more than 6 babies per woman in 1984 to fewer than 3 just 15 years later. Iran boasted the world's largest condom factory, mandatory pre-marriage sex education, and a highly educated population utilizing advanced healthcare. Yet, the free Western media had completely ignored this monumental cultural shift, leaving educated Westerners to blindly assume that Iranian society was entirely static and archaic. it is incredibly common to assume that specific religious values forever dictate family size. However, the data thoroughly dismantles this assumption. When analyzing global demographics, there is no significant difference in the birth rates of the great world religions. Christian populations living in extreme poverty have large families, just as Muslim populations do. Today, across all major faiths, once families escape extreme poverty and women gain access to education and contraception, the average number of children drops dramatically. In almost every bedroom across the globe, couples are quietly planning for smaller, healthier families. The tendency to label specific values as eternally tied to a particular culture or religion is simply false. Values transform continuously. Sweden, widely recognized today for its liberal attitudes towards sex and progressive family policies, was entirely different just a few generations ago. A typical Swedish grandfather born in the late 19th century embodied deeply patriarchal, conservative values, taking no part in child rearing and refusing to even discuss contraception. Furthermore, in the 1960s, abortion was heavily restricted in Sweden, prompting young Swedish women to travel to Catholic Poland to secure safe, legal procedures. 5 years later, the two nations reversed their policies entirely. Cultures are fluid. They are not destined to remain frozen in their past. This fluidity is increasingly evident across Asia, where traditional patriarchal values are often championed by older generations as unchangeable cultural pillars. Yet modern women in these regions are actively rejecting these constraints. A highly successful young banker in Hong Kong confessed that while she desired children, she could not tolerate the traditional, unequal expectations placed upon a wife. Similarly, young female students in Bangladesh and Afghanistan speak passionately about their desire for modern marriages built on equality and shared planning. The restrictive values often labeled as inherently Asian, African, or Islamic are merely the same patriarchal structures that existed in the West decades ago, and they are vanishing in the face of social and economic progress. To break free from the destiny instinct, one must recognize that slow change is not the same as no change. A growth rate of just 1% per year might seem imperceptible, but it results in a total transformation over a human lifetime. Consider environmental protection. In the year 1900, a mere fraction of a percent of the Earth's surface was protected. Today, that number has climbed to a staggering 15%. We must also remain vigilant in updating our knowledge. Unlike the laws of physics, knowledge in the social sciences has a rapid expiration date. Facts regarding global health and wealth spoil quickly, and we must constantly refresh our understanding to avoid navigating the present with obsolete maps. When tempted to believe that a culture is static, simply talking to the older generation reveals the radical shifts in values that have occurred within a single family tree. Gathering examples of recent cultural transformations, such as the rapid acceptance of same-sex marriage in the United States, further shatters the illusion of destiny. Ultimately, escaping the destiny instinct requires profound humility and vision. Even those who dedicate their lives to studying global progress can fall victim to low expectations. After delivering a passionate address to the African Union detailing how extreme poverty could be eradicated across the continent within 20 years, the speaker was gently rebuked by the organization's chairwoman, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma. She pointed out that simply escaping extreme poverty to live in ordinary poverty was not the goal. Africans, she explained, possess the exact same vision as Europeans, a fully modern society where families could enjoy weekends at the beach. Assuming that any population is destined to settle for anything less is the ultimate failure of imagination. Recognizing that every society is on a trajectory toward progress, however slow, is the essence of a fact-based worldview. Chapter 8. The Single Perspective Instinct. Who can we trust? Attempting to construct an accurate understanding of the world based entirely on the curated narratives of the news media is a profoundly flawed endeavor. It is comparable to trying to understand a person's entire character and physical appearance by looking solely at a photograph of their foot. While the foot is undeniably a real part of the person, it is a highly limited and often unflattering fragment. The photograph is not presenting a falsehood, but it is severely restricting the truth by omitting the rest of the body. If the daily news cannot provide a complete and reliable portrait of global reality, where should we turn? The logical alternative seems to be the experts, individuals who dedicate their entire professional lives to studying and mastering a specific domain. However, relying exclusively on experts comes with its own unique set of hazards that must be carefully navigated. The single perspective instinct. Human beings are naturally drawn to elegant, uncomplicated ideas. There is a deep psychological satisfaction in suddenly feeling that a single concept illuminates a vast array of complex issues. However, this intellectual comfort easily becomes a dangerous trap. When we embrace a simple idea, we often slide into the belief that it can perfectly explain everything, or that it is the ultimate remedy for all our societal ills. The world is suddenly painted in absolute binary colors. We conclude that all suffering is caused by a singular evil that must be eradicated, or that all prosperity relies on a single policy that must be universally applied. This irresistible pull towards solitary causes and solitary remedies is what I term the single perspective instinct. Consider, for instance, the powerful concept of the free market. While inherently valuable, it can easily mutate into a dogmatic conviction that all societal problems stem exclusively from government interference. Under this rigid lens, the only conceivable path forward is the total liberation of the market through relentless tax cuts and deregulation. Conversely, the noble pursuit of equality can solidify into the simplistic notion that all human suffering is a direct product of inequality, leading to the rigid belief that the compulsory redistribution of wealth is the sole cure for every ailment. Adopting a single perspective is undeniably efficient. It allows an individual to effortlessly generate opinions and proclaim solutions without the arduous task of investigating the unique nuances of each new problem. But efficiency is the enemy of genuine understanding. Becoming a fanatic for one specific idea actively blinds you to any evidence that contradicts your paradigm. If your goal is to truly comprehend reality, this tunnel vision is catastrophic. To cultivate a fact-based worldview, you must subject your most cherished ideas to relentless stress testing. You must acknowledge the boundaries of your own knowledge and cultivate a genuine curiosity for data that disrupts your worldview. Instead of seeking out the comforting echo chambers of those who share your exact opinions, you must actively view those who challenge and contradict you as invaluable assets in your pursuit of truth. I have personally misjudged the world countless times. While harsh encounters with reality have often corrected my course, engaging with individuals who hold fundamentally different perspectives has been equally vital. Holding a few rigorously tested, accurate opinions is vastly superior to harboring a multitude of flawed, untested ones. This rigid adherence to a single perspective is typically driven by either professional specialization or political ideology. The professionals, experts and activists. Experts and activists dedicate themselves to specific, often critical causes. However, their profound immersion in a single subject can severely distort their broader perception. When a professional spends their life mastering a specific tool, they naturally look for opportunities to use it. There is an old saying that if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem begins to look like a nail. If an expert has spent decades analyzing a particular issue, they will inevitably inflate the global significance of that specific problem and champion their specialized solution above all others. While their deep knowledge is indispensable for addressing certain challenges, it is fundamentally inadequate for solving every challenge. Reality demands a diverse, multifaceted approach rather than a single, universal fix. Numbers are not the single solution. While I am a relentless advocate for data, I do not harbor a blind love for numbers themselves. Data is merely a vehicle. Its true value lies entirely in its capacity to illuminate the human condition. A purely statistical perspective is just another dangerous single perspective. To truly grasp the state of the world, we must look behind the digits to the flesh and blood realities they represent. This limitation became starkly apparent during my interactions with researchers conducting global surveys. Organizations frequently gather vast amounts of data on economic indicators, yet they are often paralyzed by cultural assumptions when it comes to other vital human metrics. For instance, teams that enthusiastically interrogated citizens about their private finances and black market activities recoiled at the suggestion of incorporating questions about sexual behavior and its relationship to income. They perceived financial probing as acceptable, but sexual probing as an offensive intrusion, artificially restricting the scope of human understanding based on arbitrary professional boundaries. The ideologue's ideology possesses an unparalleled power to unite populations and drive massive societal transformations, bringing us indispensable frameworks like liberal democracy and universal healthcare. However, ideologues are highly susceptible to the same tunnel vision that plagues specialized experts, often with far more devastating consequences. When a political philosophy, whether it be the absolute supremacy of the free market or the absolute necessity of absolute equality, is elevated above empirical evidence and practical results, the outcomes border on the absurd. The profound dangers of allowing a single ideological perspective to dictate reality are vividly illustrated by contrasting the systems of Cuba and the United States. Cuba, the healthiest of the poor. In the early 1990s, I traveled to Cuba to investigate a severe, mysterious epidemic paralyzing tens of thousands of citizens. My interactions ranged from high-level meetings with Fidel Castro to daily collaborations with exceptionally dedicated health professionals operating under an incredibly rigid and oppressive regime. I harbored no romantic illusions about communism, and my experiences there only reinforced my skepticism. The systemic inefficiencies were staggering. I witnessed desperate locals brewing toxic fluorescent alcohol in old television tubes, and I navigated a hospitality system so profoundly mismanaged that we were forced to scavenge leftover rations from a local nursing home just to secure a meal. The oppressive atmosphere was palpable, with colleagues terrified that a simple holiday greeting to a relative in Miami could cost their children their university education. Yet, paradoxically, this same centralized authoritarian system had produced health outcomes that rivaled those of the wealthiest nations on Earth. Through extreme government planning and a total mobilization of public health resources, Cuba achieved life expectancies and child survival rates that far outpaced other nations at its income level. Cuba stands as a profound testament to the danger of the single perspective. Its reality proves that the dogmatic belief that centralized governments can perfectly orchestrate human prosperity is deeply flawed, resulting in severe economic dysfunction and a tragic lack of freedom. Simultaneously, the United States healthcare system demonstrates the exact opposite ideological failure. By rigidly adhering to the belief that unregulated free markets are the sole mechanism for delivering societal goods, the US tolerates staggering inequalities in health outcomes despite vast national wealth. Neither pure centralization nor pure market capitalism holds the universal answer. The optimal solution is almost never an absolute either-or proposition. It requires the pragmatic, case-by-case balancing of regulation and freedom, discarding ideological purity in favor of what demonstrably works. Even democracy is not the single solution. As a firm believer in liberal democracy, I naturally want to assert that democratic governance is the essential prerequisite for all societal flourishing, from peace and health to rapid economic expansion. However, maintaining a fact-based worldview requires confronting uncomfortable truths the empirical evidence simply does not support. this assumption. Many of the nations that have achieved the most miraculous economic and social leaps in recent history have done so under non-democratic regimes. South Korea's unprecedented acceleration from deep poverty to advanced industrialization occurred largely under a military dictatorship. When examining the globe's fastest-growing economies in recent years, the vast majority are nations that score exceptionally poorly on indices of democratic freedom. If we stubbornly insist that democracy is the indispensable engine for economic and health improvements, we leave ourselves vulnerable to being utterly discredited by reality. A far more robust and honest approach is to champion democracy not as a guaranteed pathway to other benefits, but as a profound and essential moral goal in its own right. Factfulness. To practice. Factfulness is to recognize the moment when your imagination is being restricted by a single perspective. It is the conscious realization that relying on a solitary lens guarantees a distorted and incomplete understanding of reality. To master the single perspective instinct, you must cultivate a comprehensive intellectual toolbox rather than relying on a single hammer. You must aggressively seek out dissenting voices to test the vulnerabilities of your favorite ideas. You must maintain profound humility regarding the limits of your own expertise, acknowledging that no single discipline, not even mathematics, can fully encapsulate the human experience. You must reject the seductive allure of simple, utopian solutions, recognizing that history is littered with tragedies, justified by elegant, singular visions. Ultimately, understanding the world requires embracing its inherent complexity, synthesizing multiple viewpoints, and solving problems through pragmatic, case-by-case analysis. Chapter 10. The Urgency Instinct. In 1981, a terrifying and unidentified disease struck the rural populations surrounding the hospital where I worked in Nacala, Mozambique. Patients, primarily mothers and children, were suddenly arriving with their legs completely paralyzed. Panic rapidly infected the community, and my own mind immediately leapt to the darkest possible conclusion: an aggressive, airborne infectious plague was sweeping through the region. When the local mayor urgently inquired if the main road should be closed and a military blockade established to prevent the infection from reaching the city, I bypassed all methodical medical investigation and simply agreed. Driven by pure terror and a desperate sense of urgency, I authorized the blockade. The consequences of that rushed decision were horrific. Desperate mothers from the north, cut off from the main road and needing to reach the city markets to sell their goods, resorted to hiring fragile, unseaworthy fishing boats to cross the bay. Overcrowded and unstable in the rough waters, one of these boats capsized. 20 mothers, children, and fishermen drowned. The crushing tragedy of this event was compounded by the subsequent scientific discovery that the disease was not infectious at all. It was konzo, a severe form of cyanide poisoning caused by the consumption of unprocessed cassava roots during a period of severe famine. My rushed, unanalyzed decision, fueled by an artificial sense of urgency and fear, directly caused the deaths of the very people I was attempting to protect. The human mind is incredibly vulnerable to the sensation of an expiring clock. We are constantly bombarded by the aggressive rhetoric of salespeople and activists alike, insisting that we must act now or the opportunity will be lost forever. This relentless pressure triggers our urgency instinct, a biological remnant from our evolutionary past. When our ancestors perceived a predator in the tall grass, pausing to conduct a statistical analysis of the threat was a fatal error. Survival demanded instantaneous, unthinking action. However, in our complex modern world, the majority of the challenges we face are not leaping lions. They are intricate, systemic issues. Yet when the urgency instinct is activated, our analytical capacities immediately shut down. We stop thinking critically. We become highly susceptible to stress, and we are driven to implement drastic, poorly conceived interventions. While activists frequently deploy this tactic to galvanize support and funding. The constant ringing of the alarm bell ultimately damages their credibility, transforming them into the boy who cried wolf and leaving the public numb to genuine risks. This dangerous intersection of urgency and fear was vividly highlighted during my interactions regarding climate change. Recognizing the profound reality of global warming, a highly prominent environmental advocate requested that I utilize our animated data visualizations to project a terrifying worst-case scenario of future carbon emissions. The goal was explicitly to generate fear and prompt immediate public action. Despite my deep agreement that climate change is an existential threat requiring immediate intervention, I refused the request. I insisted that any visualization must present the probable and best-case scenarios alongside the worst. Exaggerating data to manufacture panic is a catastrophic strategy. Once the public discovers that the numbers have been manipulated to inflate the threat, trust evaporates, and they stop listening entirely. Serious global challenges demand serious, transparent data. Instead of generating artificial panic, we must demand precise measurement. It is why I persistently lobbied the Swedish government to publish its greenhouse gas emissions on a quarterly basis, treating the health of the atmosphere with the same rigorous, cool-headed statistical tracking as the national economy. The necessity of separating data from urgency was reinforced again during the 2014 Ebola crisis. As I worked on the ground in Liberia, the international media and health organizations were broadcasting a terrifying, skyrocketing curve of suspected cases, projecting apocalyptic outcomes. However, when we meticulously analyzed the laboratory data for confirmed cases, a radically different picture emerged. The confirmed infections had actually peaked 2 weeks prior and were steadily declining. The local population had rationally and effectively altered their behavior, ceasing physical contact and implementing rigorous hygiene practices. The epidemic was being contained. Yet, certain global organizations preferred to highlight the rising curve of unverified suspected cases, fearing that revealing the positive trend would diminish the sense of urgency and halt the influx of international funding. This is a profound ethical failure. Data must never be weaponized as a tool for public relations or a call to action. It must serve as an accurate, unvarnished reflection of reality, allowing us to evaluate whether our interventions are actually working. Acknowledging that the world is improving does not mean we should slide into apathy. There are genuine, monumental risks that threaten human progress, but they must be managed with absolute analytical clarity rather than panic. We must focus our collective resources on preventing a global pandemic, avoiding financial collapse, averting the devastation of a third world war, mitigating climate change, and entirely eradicating the remaining pockets of extreme poverty. These are the true mega-dangers of our era. They require robust international collaboration, meticulous tracking, and measured step-by-step interventions, unclouded by the blinding fog of panic. Factfulness, practicing. Factfulness means recognizing the specific moment when a situation is being framed as an urgent, now or never crisis, and consciously understanding that this framing is almost always an exaggeration designed to bypass your critical thinking. To master the urgency instinct, you must actively force yourself to take a breath and allow your analytical mind to cool down before taking action. You must relentlessly insist on seeing the data, discarding any information that is accurate but irrelevant or relevant but inaccurate. You must remain deeply skeptical of fortune tellers who predict the future with absolute certainty, demanding to see a full spectrum of scenarios ranging from the best to the worst case. Finally, you must cultivate a profound wariness toward drastic, untested actions. True, sustainable progress is rarely achieved through panicked leaps. It is forged through measured, step-by-step practical improvements that are constantly evaluated for their actual impact on reality. Chapter 11. Factfulness in Practice. How Factfulness Saved My Life. In the sweltering heat of 1989, Deep within the remote Bandundu region of what was then Zaire, my reliance on a fact-based worldview transitioned from an academic exercise to a matter of immediate physical survival. I was stationed in a rural village conducting critical medical research on the devastating, paralyzing disease known as Konzo. My daily routine involved drawing blood samples from the afflicted villagers to trace the origins of the illness. However, communication across vast cultural and linguistic divides is inherently fragile. Without my knowledge, a terrifying rumor had taken root among the local population. They believed that I was not a doctor attempting to halt a plague, but a profiteer harvesting their blood to sell on the international market. One afternoon, as I was packing my medical supplies, the atmosphere outside my small clinic abruptly shifted. A low, rhythmic chanting began to echo, steadily growing louder and more hostile. I stepped out to find myself completely surrounded by a dense, furious mob of villagers, many of whom were brandishing heavy agricultural machetes. Their faces were contorted with genuine terror and rage. I was entirely cut off from any route of escape. The instinctual panic that I have so often warned against surged through my own veins. I could see the absolute certainty in their eyes. They were convinced they were defending their community from a monster. No amount of desperate pleading or frantic hand gestures on my part could penetrate the wall of their fear. Just as the crowd surged forward, a local woman stepped out from the tightly packed ranks. She was a middle-aged mother, someone whose children I had previously examined. Standing directly between the blades of the mob and my trembling body, she raised her hands and demanded silence. To my astonishment, she did not appeal to their emotions or beg for mercy. Instead, she delivered a masterclass in factfulness. She spoke loudly and clearly, reminding the crowd of the devastating measles epidemics that had once slaughtered their infants. She then meticulously explained the concept of vaccines, tracing the logic of how research and blood samples had ultimately brought the life-saving medicine to their village, virtually eradicating the disease. She connected that historical triumph to the current work I was doing with Konzo. She did not tell them what to feel, she simply gave them the empirical context they lacked. It was a rigorous, profoundly rational argument, delivered in the midst of blinding hysteria. Slowly, miraculously, the tension began to evaporate. The machetes were lowered. The mob's fear, which had been fed by a dramatic and terrifying misconception, simply could not survive exposure to the unvarnished truth. They nodded, murmured their understanding, and peacefully dispersed into the jungle. That brilliant, courageous woman utilized the power of a fact-based perspective to dismantle panic and quite literally save my life. Factfulness in practice. The power of replacing dramatic fear with analytical clarity is not limited to averting physical violence. It is the essential framework for navigating our intensely complex modern world. Practicing factfulness in our daily lives requires a deliberate, systematic overhaul of how we process information, conduct our businesses, and interact with global narratives. For the vast world of business and global economics, shedding the overdramatic world view is an absolute financial imperative. Multinational corporations still overwhelmingly base their investment strategies on the obsolete binary generalization of the developed versus the developing world. By blindly assuming that billions of individuals residing in the global south are permanently locked in extreme poverty, these institutions remain entirely ignorant of the largest and fastest economic expansion in the history of human commerce. The reality is that the vast majority of humanity has ascended to levels 2 and 3. These are massive, emerging populations of consumers who now desire bicycles, basic cosmetics, improved roofing, and reliable refrigeration. Businesses that cling to outdated stereotypes will continue to market exclusively to the saturated, wealthy populations of level 4, while visionary enterprises that look at the actual data will capture the unprecedented opportunities blooming across Africa and Asia. Similarly, Journalists and consumers of media must radically redefine their relationship with the news. We must accept that the media is an inherently imperfect lens, systematically designed to capture the anomalies, the tragedies, and the sudden disasters. We cannot demand that journalists cease reporting on the terrible events that demand our attention, but as consumers, we must cultivate the internal discipline to recognize what is being omitted. We must continuously remind ourselves that slow, incremental progress, the billions of days where crops do not fail, where children are quietly vaccinated, and where peace holds, will never generate a headline. A fact-based society requires citizens who do not outsource their entire worldview to the daily news cycle, but instead actively anchor themselves in the enduring structural data of human advancement. Education. If we are to permanently dismantle the overdramatic worldview, the transformation must begin in our classrooms. The current educational paradigm frequently commits a devastating error. It attempts to teach children a static, unyielding set of facts about the world. But facts regarding human society, demographics, and global health have a remarkably short expiration date. If we teach our children the population statistics or the poverty rates of today, we are equipping them with knowledge that will be entirely obsolete by the time they reach adulthood. Instead of demanding the memorization of temporary data, we must teach the next generation the fundamental architecture of factfulness. We must explicitly instruct them about the 10 cognitive instincts that will attempt to deceive them. Children should be taught how to recognize the gap instinct, how to spot an exponential curve, and how to separate genuine danger from mere fear. They must learn that it is entirely possible for the world to be in a state that is objectively bad, yet simultaneously getting measurably better. Furthermore, we must instill in them a profound humility. They need to understand that the world is in constant motion, and that the only way to remain accurate is to continuously update their knowledge. If we raise a generation equipped to expect bad news without falling into despair, to interrogate simple perspectives, and to evaluate human progress across the 4 income levels, we will forge a society entirely immune to the paralysis of artificial panic and the destructive allure of radical ideologies. A final note: for decades my life has been defined by an unyielding crusade against global ignorance. I have battled the pervasive gloom and the stubborn misconceptions that cloud the minds of the most educated and influential individuals on our planet. Yet the core message of this lifelong endeavor has never been one of blind, irrational optimism. The world is fraught with immense, undeniable challenges. We still face the genuine threats of global pandemics, the existential crisis of a changing climate, and the enduring, unacceptable tragedy of the millions who still languish in extreme level 1 poverty. But confronting these monumental tasks requires energy, cooperation, and hope. An overdramatic worldview, constantly bombarding us with the illusion that everything is deteriorating and that all past efforts have failed, drains us of that very energy. It leaves us stressed, cynical, and paralyzed by the false belief that human suffering is an inescapable destiny. A fact-based worldview is the ultimate antidote to this despair. It is profoundly comforting to realize that the world, despite all its flaws, is in a vastly better state than our anxieties suggest. The data proves beyond any shadow of a doubt that human interventions work. We have halved extreme poverty, we have conquered ancient diseases, and we have brought the majority of mankind into a stable, advancing middle ground. When we look at the world through the clear, unclouded lens of factfulness, we do not see a hopeless tragedy. We see a magnificent ongoing triumph of human resilience and ingenuity. Armed with this truth, we can step forward into the future not with fear, but with the quiet, unshakable confidence required to finish the job.